Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for our webinar, Ransomware in 2021. We're going to give everyone just a few moments to get logged in, get settled. So feel free to grab a water, a coffee, or a beverage of choice, and we'll get going here in just a few minutes. All right. Thank you all so much again for being here today. Super excited to have our webinar this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Jonathan Reiber in just a moment, but as a reminder, you are able to ask questions throughout the entirety of the presentation. If you check out the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions function where you can submit questions for our speakers to answer live on camera today. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's great to have all of you here, and it is my immense pleasure to introduce Maggie MacAlpine to you. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Jonathan. It's my immense pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining. So Maggie is a security strategist at Cybersecurity, and she's really like a great cybersecurity expert with background, with a diverse background. You may have recently seen her in an HBO documentary, which is great. Nice to appear on HBO as an expert. So kudos there. And she is an election security expert as well as a ransomware expert. And she's a security strategist in the office of the CISO at Cybersecurity. And today she's going to talk to us about ransomware. But the interesting thing also is Maggie's a writer. She's a short story writer, and you should be able to see her creative writing out there at some point here soon. And she's going to talk to us about piracy, which is interesting because she also lives in New Hampshire, which obviously, like New England, has this history of piracy. So, Maggie, we're really excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining again.
Yeah, thanks, and thank you for indulging my tangent on piracy, which will be coming about midway through the presentation. So with that hook in mind, do we want to just dive right in?
Yeah, let's dive in. Over to you.
Thanks. Quick, you already introduced me, so we don't need this one. So one of the things, so obviously everyone's here to hear about ransomware, and I don't want to risk saying things people already know, but we're still going to kind of start with a little bit of an introduction. So one thing we're going to start with is, why do attackers use ransomware? I think that this is it should be sort of inherently obvious. Money is usually the answer to a lot of criminal activities, but like why this particular tactic is more to the point. And that comes down to things like popularity, complexity, and impact. And so things that are highly complex often have high impact. Very complex attacks are very rarely popular, but can have a great deal of impact. Popular things are not necessarily complex and may not have as much impact as others, but they're easier to implement. So we're at this convergence now where the complexity and the popularity and the impact are all converging to see this just crazy spike in ransomware attacks. And it's really gone from just this sort of one of many attacks we saw in the toolbox to dominating the mind share, I would say, of defenders and now of governments, and of the attackers themselves are now pivoting to this, I would say. So let's just look at quickly what ransomware has been doing to businesses. The Cybersecurity has recently put out a study, ransomware called Ransomware: The True Cost of Business. Hopefully it'll be useful to some of you if you say need to make a case higher up the ladder for why we should be doing more anti-ransomware stuff and shoring up our cybersecurity capabilities. But the loss of revenue and the is what it a lot of these statistics are eyebrow raising and speak for themselves, but 66% of organizations reported significant loss of revenue following a ransomware attack. They had brand and reputational damage. They lost C-level talent. They had employee layoffs through loss of money, and probably just lost morale as well. Getting hit with a ransomware attack is not something that is necessarily easily recoverable from. And some of the more recent attacks we've seen are even more devastating. We've seen cases where even with the ransom paid, the information has already actually been destroyed, or it's not returned, or paying is just giving the ransomware criminals sort of this green light to hit you again and again, because they now know that this is a guaranteed cash cow. They're basically shearing the sheep almost at a certain point instead of just killing it. So when you see these sort of plans in place, and we're going to come into this a little bit later, of like, we'll just sort of plan to recover once we're hit. I think my boss, Sam Curry, had a really great quote where he said, that's a little bit like saying, I'm going to buy life insurance instead of health insurance. So like, I'm just going to plan to die rather than plan to not get sick. So obviously, full disclosure, I come from an endpoint security company called Cybersecurity, so obviously that's an element of our interest in this, but I actually find this subject just academically interesting as well. So, you know, don't get too turned off if I, you know, some of my slides mention endpoints.
We feel that, Maggie, yeah. We feel your interest, yeah.
You know, we're all here for our reason. But so what changed, I think, is actually a really interesting question. So like, this is kind of our old slide from last year about timeline of ransomware attacks. And you've got some, you know, well-known ones, maybe some familiar faces, Ryuk and Sodino Kibi. Cybersecurity put out a really good study on that one. But when I was looking at how do I make, you know, a chart to sort of have this, show that exponential growth in the last year, I actually found that Information is Beautiful had beat me to it. And they had this presentation where you just see like just those few around 2017, and there's a few little clusters, which are the municipal attacks that we had, where a lot of like little townships got hit by ransomware, but then it just explodes in 2021. And you start seeing just how popular this form of attack gets. And obviously we have the more, how shall I say, high profile attacks. I think Colonial Pipeline is really the one to speak of. And
can you go back to that for just a second?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to it. Sorry. I didn't want to I didn't want to preview my next slide too much because I have a cool animation there, but honestly this is probably a little bit more striking anyway.
Well, no, I just think if you could, so is it essentially like the size of the circle is the cost associated with the attack, or is it just that we're seeing
in fact, number of devices hit?
The size of the circle is the number of devices hit?
Yeah, the size, I think it's the size of the attack. Yeah, so you have Cassia there is, you know, obviously dominating it because it hit so many through that supply chain attack. What was so interesting actually about Cassia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is that we were seeing with SolarWinds, right, the beginning of the year, supply chain attacks were kind of beginning to dominate the discussion around what we should be worried about. And then, of course, ransomware happened with Colonial Pipeline and the meatpacking company, JBS, I think I have that, yeah, JBS right there. And then you had Cassia, which is almost like you couldn't have plotted this out better as the convergence of those two threats, which is a supply chain ransomware attack, where you know, hundreds of people have been hit now since. So, you know, are we going to probably be seeing, I mean, we're probably going to be seeing more of those too, but that was a pretty devastating one because how do you even protect, I mean, that's somewhat, you know, the question one may pose to themselves after seeing Cassia. Certainly what I was asking myself when I read the headline was, you know, what are you supposed to do when it could be anybody in your supply chain's vulnerabilities that you have to worry about? So yeah, I mean, this was just, let's see if I could get, okay, good, it does work. Yeah, this was just sort of our old slide, which is just like, so for a period there, one of the more fearsome ransomware attacks that were happening were mostly against healthcare. So, and then Colonial Pipeline happened, and that kind of changed the discussion and changed the game. So before that, we were scared of people dying, and we still are, by the way, because what makes them such attractive targets in the case of healthcare is they have such a limited such limited needs around downtime, right? If you can't access a patient's records, a patient could very well die. And so giving these sort of blanket orders like don't ever pay the ransom becomes much more complicated when the time involved isn't just, you know, oh, we might have to shutter our offices. Oh, we might not hit a revenue target. Oh, maybe people will have to stay home for a week because we can't get something working. And it becomes instead, someone might die. And so that made them very attractive targets because of the almost guaranteed payout there. And so that's what a lot of our earlier discussions around ransomware were sort of based around, which was the healthcare community. And then Colonial Pipeline happened and it wiped out this whole thing because now the government is paying attention. Now critical infrastructure is involved and the military. You know, is involved because this is sort of an element of what we've always been kind of saying might happen with cyber attacks at some point, right? Is that somebody overseas is going to shut down the power grid, is going to shut down, the water, pipeline into New York City, and people are going to die in large numbers. And this has always been sort of a boogeyman, at the edges of the cybersecurity discussion. And now with Colonial Pipeline, it was sort of a big smack in the face. It's like, for the first time, we've actually seen something that could really cripple a nation. And even more fearsome is the fact that DarkSide, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, DarkSide said they didn't even mean to hit Colonial Pipeline. Like, that was not their intention. And I don't know if that's actually, I think that's actually scarier in many ways. Whether or not they're lying is the question. But if they're lying, then it was an intentional attack, and that has its own scary aspects. But if they aren't lying, if they really didn't know what they were hitting, first of all, how? But second of all, it was that easy for them, presumably. So just a quick reference, like what changed, just to get back to the slides a little bit. So so up until now, it was what this used to be called a spray and pray, but it was basically just like trying to hit any target you could get at. And now the attacks have become much more targeted. With more research and more difficulty in attacking a company comes more gain. So you go, right? You don't sue somebody who doesn't have any money. You don't rob somebody who doesn't have any money. You go after people who can pay. And these ransoms have risen as a result in terms of the payout. But also, I would argue that the anonymous payment methods like Bitcoin have had a huge influence on this, because suddenly now you can get away with the money, right? You don't have to do some complicated shell game of companies and funneling money and hiding it and whatever you're going to do. You can get you have anonymous digital currency, which has always been sort of a limiter as far as crime goes, is paper traceable currency. And you also have cyber insurance. Ironically, the thing that many C-levels want to turn to protect themselves is the thing that may be putting a lot of people in danger. And I know that maybe is sort of an outrageous thing to say. Apologies to any insurance people in the audience. But when asked, why are you always going after companies that have cyber insurance? One hacker presumably answered, "Oh, we hacked the list of who was insured from that company." So basically, it's now become a list, not of people who are protected, but of people who are guaranteed to pay. And as that number rises and as that risk rises, you're seeing an even bigger and bigger ecosystem of people who are guaranteed to pay. And then we're going to see some more shocking statistics later. Those people who have insurance are getting hit again. So it's not necessarily, I can understand the impulse to say, look, we just don't know where this attack's coming from. It's just easier to get insurance rather than pump, questionable millions of dollars into our cybersecurity practice, protection and department, not knowing if they'll even be enough. It would, I'd rather just take that money and get a really good insurance policy, but you may just be painting a target on your back with that. And also there's the fact that all the money comes back. But again, cyber insurance has become my new favorite thing. And actually, we might as well mention it now. I find another parallel there, which may become a talk for a future time, of the parallels between cyber insurance and Dark Ages French kings. That's what I
was going to say. I was going to say, Dark Ages French kings.
Absolutely. Yeah. Such an obvious, right? No, because when Vikings began to attack Europe during the Dark Ages, right? They wanted to shear the sheep, not kill it. Or rather, they realized that they could shear the sheep, not kill it. First, they hit and they raided, monasteries and kingdoms and whatnot. But then they realized that they could just show up at the gate, because now they had put the fear of God into everybody, and they could ask for a payment to go away. And the small petty kings of that and chieftains and whatever that era paid them off. Obviously, it was the easiest thing to do to save the lives of those involved. They couldn't have survived the attack without taking terrible damage. But that meant the Vikings went, oh, cool, well, we don't want to fight either. We don't want to risk our lives. So we'll just show up every year and we'll demand a certain amount of ransom money to protect people. And that sort of emerges its own, almost like a proto-government organized crime. You see all those parallels there, right? It's protection money. And that's kind of my fear with cyber insurance, right? All these individual companies, I don't blame them for paying off ransoms. Obviously, they can't survive these attacks necessarily, and it's what they have to do. But in doing so, the impulse to say no ransom should be paid ever is you want to stop this threat at the root. And you don't want to create this ecosystem where people who can just be ransomware farmers or shepherds, just rolling up and demanding their protection money every few years. So that's my fear, but that's a talk for another day. So thank you for indulging me on that point. And here's kind of the point I was making earlier, so I should probably rearrange these. What's a good target? 99.999% uptime requirement, small IT teams, those who use legacy systems. And I think under legacy systems, and verbally I'll say this because I won't write this down, we see lazy cybersecurity. Big companies that have the money and should be doing better and should have known to do better, and maybe even been warned to do better, but who just put it off and then became headline news, like Colonial Pipeline, who was trying to hire a head of cybersecurity during the attack. So, you know, don't let that be you, I suppose would be my argument there. And then, of course, we're getting into why do people pay? I think it should be pretty obvious why people pay, right? They want their data unlocked, and they want to return. Yep. They want to return to normal. So let's just get through this. Okay, yeah. So quickly on the subject, because I do want to get through. We're at 15 minutes. Yeah, this is how long I thought it would take. I can speed it up a little. But ransom has another aspect to it now. It's got extortion and blackmail, which I think is really fun. And by that, I mean fun. So in addition to just getting your data and taking it away from you, we're also going to extort you and we're going to blackmail you. Mm-hmm. So we're going to make your life really miserable on multiple fronts. So here's the old one, right? We're going to exploit your fear of regulatory actions. We're going to make you pay maybe in secret so that you don't get in trouble. And that's one reason why we can't just blanket ban payouts, right? Because that we might create a more hidden underground of people who are paying out. And then all they will probably see happen is that the payout amounts will become smaller so that you can hit somebody a bunch of times and it'll never be so much that they, you know, can't pay it out without suffering only a minor blip in their operations. But actually what I think is the really scary thing is the thing that DarkSide put out in Colonial Pipeline, which is triple extortion. So we will publish if you do not pay, we will publish all your data and store it on our Tor CDNs for at least 6 months, which basically means we're going to open up all your data for free for all in the dark web. That's like the double extortion, right? We're going to ask you to pay twice. One, not to release your information on Tor. One, to give it back to you. And 3, we're going to send a notification. We're also going to blackmail you in terms of losing face. We're going to contact the media. We're going to tell them that this hack is coming, and the juicy story will just definitely ruin your reputation. But even worse, we're actually going to go reach out to potential short sellers of your stock and tell them that when we're going to release the information about the fact you've been hit with this ransomware attack, and we're going to extort you on that point as well. So once they have your data, I think these criminals have realized they can get you every which way. And also the fact that they're going after the payment systems is just a side note where you can't collect any money in the meantime while they're doing that. It's made it extremely one-to-one, you know, what the risk around cybersecurity is and the risk of getting attacked by a group of hackers. Though the other thing that we're going to get to in the next part here that's interesting about this particular information, if you can see it, I apologize if it's small, is them saying that they will not attack certain types of organizations. And this is where my interest in piracy suddenly converged with ransomware, which is that by claiming to be sort of gentleman rogues, Robin Hood figures, people who are just trying to make a buck against the bad guys and, you know, who aren't necessarily bad people, they won't hit schools, they won't hit hospitals, they sort of are almost inviting an elevation to folk hero status, among other things. And I can pause right now here for a second, Jonathan, or we can continue into my quick pivot and tangent into why piracy makes such a parallel here.
Well, I say let's keep going.
Okay, great. Okay, so so as I was saying with the DarkSide gang, that was when the light bulb went up for me, because they were saying we don't attack hospitals, we don't attack educators, we don't attack good guys, we don't attack governments because we don't want them breathing down our neck. But the other thing they said was that we didn't mean to attack Colonial Pipeline. That was an accident that violates our code, and we have a code. So the idea of the, you know, gentleman thief, the criminal with a code, that's as old as Pulp Fiction, right? Of every kind. But I think with ransomware in particular, we see this parallel of criminals of another time really come into fruition, come into focus. So apologies to anybody who's compared hackers to pirates before. I'm not trying to say that I'm the first person to ever think of this, but ransomware has made it so striking because the methods are so similar. So you have a force that can strike and retreat quickly. basically on the high seas, who can mask where they're from, usually by false flags. And you can create this ecosystem, as I said below, of wild profitability, disproportionate to the otherwise, skilled level of the people involved. And also this idea of getting a ransom is also extremely key to piracy in history. So we're going to quickly throw out Treasure Island here. We're not going to think about those guys. We're going to think about the actual historical pirates. So one of them was a guy named Henry Every, arch captain pirate. I think it was Henry or Thomas Every. Anyway, Every. He also put out a manifesto saying, "I will never attack English ships." Well, you know what? He did attack English ships, and he came back and said, "Well, it was an accident. I'm still an English friend." And when DarkSide hit the government, the U.S. government, they came back and said the same thing. They said, "We didn't mean to. We're still apolitical." Do we believe them? They are criminals. What were they hoping to gain? Are they obfuscating themselves? All of that is kind of what makes this metaphor stand out. But what I'm really proposing is that by seeing this parallel of ransomware gangs and pirates, people who strike quickly, who seize assets, who sell them, and who vanish again, and who are often protected by nation states, or at least nominally protected by them, not acting against certain ones. We actually are finding in this model a model of how to combat it. Because the nice thing about having a historical parallel means we don't all have to do this all over again. So while the digital sphere may seem unprecedented in many ways because of the technologies involved, and in many ways we're still in the infancy, we're still figuring things out, we don't necessarily have to start from zero. So if we accept that pirates and ransomware gangs are very similar, we can start dipping into naval history and how pirates have been defeated in the past. So I started dipping into essays from the Naval War College and found this really striking quote about how piracy is a non-traditional security threat that cannot be solved through military solutions. Piracy should be rooted out by attacking sources of their strength on land, disrupting their organizational structures, and isolating them from their source of support. In particular, this means destroying their bases and hideouts, cutting off their sources of capital, technology, and recruitment, crippling the middlemen and markets that allow them to dispose of their loot. From Piracy in Maritime Asia, Current Trends. Now, I have seen people on Twitter saying we should just go after these guys, right? We should just bomb ransomware gangs. We should arrest them. We should find them. Well, as long as the supply is still there, as long as they can make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, as perhaps a decently skilled pen tester working as a ransomware gang, it doesn't matter if you take out DarkSide or people who you later say are DarkSide, or any of these individual guys, or gals. Maybe the gals are just not getting caught. You're always going to have more of them. The incentives are just too high. And we saw the same with the Somali pirates, right? There was a great article that I also found where they were saying we could maybe stop this threat, but we'd have to basically invade Somalia. People would die. We'd violate international law. That would be hugely expensive. And at a certain point, we just can't do it. And we just have to basically have a couple patrols in the area helping out those who do get hit. Because this is an international problem, but it's an international problem that isn't easily solved. So when I do say that we have piracy as a parallel, I'm not trying to say, oh, now we can just easily solve it. I'm saying that this just means we have a model to work from. So my proposal is basically this. We are no longer in the Wild West of the internet. We're in the age of sail. And we solve the age of sail and piracy through things like maritime law. We saw the internet is not sort of this abstract cyberspace. It is international waters these days. International waters where a criminal might strike what they think is just a wealthy target that later turns out to be a political target. One where they can hide under a false flag, claiming to be from a certain nation. So you can't just go to war with a nation that is of the ship that attacked you, because that might not be true. And it's probably as easy to run up the flag as it is nowadays to hide where you're coming from. So we can't just indiscriminately claim to know where attacks are coming from, very similar to the high seas. There's also the fact that we have to be aware of the fact that you can, how do I say this? We're dealing with the early days of in national navies, like we saw at the beginning of the age of sail, which is that nations didn't necessarily have the money and sophistication to have the level of navy that they needed. So they leaned on private citizens and privateers who were nominally working with them. And that means that those people going after their enemies aren't necessarily doing so at orders from the top. And I think so when we say the Russian hacker army, who is, I would argue, privateers, because they will sometimes work for the Russian government, or at least avoid Russian government targets the way DarkSide did. We are actually talking about privateers, and we should be calling them really the Russian hacker navy. And likewise, we have North Korea, right? North Korea that actually has what I would call an official hacker navy, where they go after targets to bring booty home, and they are working officially for the state. They are sanctioned by the state. They are trained by the state. And then you have the other level where you have Chinese hackers who are moonlighting as hackers, but may work for the Chinese government. Makes it very blurry to know, are they working on their own time or not? Are they being nudged? Are they just getting a blind eye? Are they actively turned down? And when you start to sort of use this parallel, you can start to see like, oh, okay, this is how we manage these people, and you have to do, and how we deal with them. We remove safe harbors, you apply national pressures, you make sure that they can't actually spend their money anywhere. And that way you can actually begin to reduce the desire and supply. And that's why I actually have in my notes here, Biden's ransom. He's put a $10 million bounty on information about ransomware gangs. He's putting pressure on Russia, which is creating the safe harbor like we saw in our previous quote here. About going after their safe harbors, right? That's where you have to hit them.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that later.
Yeah. And so that was basically, as I was saying, violent whack-a-mole is not going to work. We can't attack these guys individually. You have to reduce the supply and the incentives. So that's the end of my little pirate tangent. The next step was just going to be about how people can protect themselves. But Jonathan, I'm also going to once again pause and say if we want to talk about other things.
No, this is great. Let's keep going, and we'll come back to questions.
Sure. I know I said I would be much faster than I ended up being, and you were completely
You're doing
right.
Great. We love it. I'm learning a ton. Everyone's learning a ton.
I'm so glad. So how do you protect yourself? To pay or not to pay? Because obviously one of the easiest things, we would just hope you don't get hit, do your best, pay when they do hit you, or get your insurance. Except that you're more 80% likely to get attacked again if you pay. There's no guarantee they're actually going to give you back your data. There's no guarantee that they're not going to hit you again. There's no guarantee that your policy is going to cover everything that you lose, especially when it comes to public image and company morale and C-level positions, people who move on. And the ransom demands are only increasing because it is so lucrative. And right now, major targets are getting hit and can't do anything about it. So I would say, unfortunately, right now, besides, like quick aside, get endpoint security solutions like Cybereason. Okay, we got that out of the way. Policies and people in place. So even if you do everything right, you could still be hit, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing everything right. So there are ransomware attacks that have actually gone into the backups and corrupted the backups as well. So there is a case to be made that just doing your backups and staying up to date on those is not enough. I would say it's never a downside to raising the floor on difficulty, right? So it's okay to stay on top of backups, even if there are cases of ransomware attacks where the backups are also poisoned. So stay on top of your backups. Keep your cybersecurity hygiene on the up to date. Invest in your cybersecurity department and do things like training for such an incident. Just knowing who you're going to reach out to and what government agencies you should be talking to. Those are things you do not want. That's an airplane you do not want to be flying while it's in the air. You want to know those things before this sort of attack can happen, so you're not caught flat-footed. Yeah, okay. So this is obviously a little bit of an older one. Sorry, there's a little bit of inconsistency in slide colors. So update your systems, prevent the preventable, raise the floor. That's always important. Good cybersecurity hygiene is not going to necessarily stop every attack, but you know what? It at least will stop the embarrassing ones. The ones that are just like somebody's 6-letter password got hacked and now we are on the front page of the news. That's not somewhere you want to be. Make sure you're training, make sure you're practicing, make sure that your executives understand this threat. I have actually, my quick aside, I didn't mean to say this earlier, there is a rather macabre thing you could say, which is ransomware may be one of the best things that's ever happened to cybersecurity defenders, because we can suddenly explain in dollar amounts what the actual loss is going to be to people higher, up the chain, or those who are, with the handle on the purse strings. I don't mean that to be flippant. What I mean is, it's not information that's getting stolen. Information being stolen is now step one of what can be a much more devastating financial attack. The incentives are so clear. It's so one-to-one now. They're going to shut down our payment system for this many days until we pay. And then until that time, we're not going to be able to process payments. We're not going to have any revenue. It's just very easy to understand in a way that I think other types of attacks, like stealing the personal information of customers, maybe wasn't always, where fines might be the only financial damage you have to worry about. And that's only if you get caught. And even then, it might be a slap on the wrist. This is very one-to-one, very devastating, and as far as we can tell, isn't going anywhere yet, despite heroic efforts by defenders and governments to address this threat. So I would say, do we have any questions?
That's great. I have lots of questions, and in a moment, or not just questions, but points of departure potentially for further discussion. This is an exceptional presentation. It's great. I think the piracy narrative in particular is so historically rich. And I want to start there with one question, and you may or may not know the answer because I didn't preview this one with you at all, but
very unrehearsed.
What was it about? Have you looked into what it was about the Somali pirate situation that drove down that threat? Like what worked recently with Somali pirates, and what analogy can we draw from that experience to our own?
I would argue, from what I've seen in the naval history I've been looking at, it didn't necessarily stop. It was just less shocking. So the reason it made the news was because it was so unbelievable that fishermen, with just their local boats, were able to storm and take over otherwise sophisticated first world country shipping boats. And then hold them ransom or otherwise engage in piratical activities. And there wasn't really a way to stop them because of not their activities in the water, but their activities on land. They could always just retreat to the shore, retreat to hideouts, retreat into urban areas, and enjoy a certain amount of shelter there. So there was really no way to stamp it out without chasing them onto land or killing them on the water, which doesn't necessarily stop the problem, may in fact make things worse if you further economically undermine a certain area. So kind of the end conclusion was we just have ships patrolling the area now, was more or less agreements internationally to allow American ships in other countries to defend their the shipping lanes. But again, these attacks are still happening.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Like you put up a modicum of a perimeter defense to secure freighters in the Gulf of Aden, for example, off of Somalia. And these boats, the Somali boats, were not heavily armed. They were relatively heavily armed compared to an unarmed freighter, because just like one small advantage on the part of the attacker. But with a modicum of investment by the part of the defenders, this is no longer making the news every day. And so to your point about Colonial Pipeline, which it's interesting to me that colonial, it has the word colonial in it when we're dealing with, in many cases, a colonial analogy problem from your piracy standpoint, is just a modicum of investment can drive down your risk considerably, right? And so we're not talking about making massive investments to improve your cybersecurity, but there are some basic capabilities that you should have, like endpoint detection, like security segmentation, like a next generation firewall, to just name three principal ones, because people tend to forget more than three, but those three should, every medium-sized enterprise that has significant financial dealings should explore at least those ones, and then should exercise its capabilities in the event of an incident. So you should be ready for it in case something happens. And I think it strikes me that the historical analogy is, like, this wasn't at least with the Somali problem as compared to the Barbary pirates problem in the 1600s or 1700s, which is a much larger element of investment. But the analogy, even for the Barbary pirates, is the U.S. was putting forces into, if I recall correctly, into North Africa. Isn't that right? Under the Barbary pirate period?
Yes, it was our first international war.
Right. Yes, and so now, as President Biden has told Vladimir Putin and has indicated in the press, like, we will respond through cyberspace against forces that potentially are attacking us, that could be ransomware gangs or otherwise. And so this is actually this mirrors analogously the response to the Barbary pirates, which is that we're going on the offense if we need to against the forces that are putting pressure on us. So the analogies, I think, are rich, because you have the modicum of investment from the intruders that break through or that are attacking the freighters, which is similar to you need these 3 capabilities or more, or to whatever you determine on the basis of your cybersecurity requirements to defend yourself. And then there's an element of the U.S. putting forward pressure on the adversary. Now, the question I wanted to revisit to you was strategically now, and we've spoken about this before, President Biden met with Vladimir Putin and had said, we're going to impose these costs on you. And what I read recently was one of the ransomware groups, I believe it was Reiber, disappeared. And the question was, did they disappear because of internal pressure from Russia, or did they disappear because they were afraid of what would happen to them, or did they disappear because a foreign government did something to them? And I think, what do you think are some of the strategies that might, what would you do if you were facing Putin right now, Maggie? What would be your recommendation to the U.S. government for what to do?
So there's a lot of topics in there that were all very rich. We don't know what happened to Reiber. They may have just gone to ground to rebrand themselves and come back in another form. I think there's I've seen enough people who I trust in cyberspace, in like the cybersecurity news space, saying I don't think that they were taken out by a government or military to believe them, because the signs just aren't there. Somebody would take credit, right, if that had been the case. If I were facing Putin right now, well, here's the thing, right? When people were saying we should just demand that these criminals get handed over to us, I thought that was incredibly naive, because Putin isn't necessarily against these guys, right? They might be a fertile training ground. They might be private forces that you can occasionally lean on, or who you just, allow to keep their skills sharp in the event of a hotter actual hostilities. So really what you might do if you say, we're going to, we want you to hand these guys over, or else, is you may just give him greater pressure to lean on on hackers and technologists within his country, basically saying, hey, you better do what we say when we say it, or, we'll turn you over in our yearly sacrifice of, a couple of low-level hacker guys that we just want to get rid of. So I don't know if necessarily there's any value to demanding that these guys get turned over. Again, that's why I'm saying you might want to just turn down the fuel on the supply incentives. And I actually was admiring the tactics that were put forward recently by Biden. Of course, time will tell if they work, by the Biden administration rather. But they put forward a $10 million bounty on information that leads to stopping these activities. They clawed back the money from the Colonial Pipeline. I think that sort of thing is really
amazing
success. Yeah, because you got to make it so they can't spend their money anywhere. It has to be less lucrative than alternative forms of making money, because because if you don't do that, right, we're going to see what's actually starting to happen right now, which is the Silicon Valley of crime. Literally, these guys are making money on these ransomware attacks, turning around and investing in young, promising, up-and-coming ransomware attackers. And that's just going to become its own, burgeoning problem of people who are now have training and investment and like office buildings and PR and HR and, like wonderful benefits packages. Like there's no reason I think that I was actually speculating that that's what was going to happen next, with enough money from ransomware hitting these hacker ecosystems, that we're going to start seeing an almost organized crime legitimacy to them. And literally, like the next day, I saw the article that was like, "There's a Silicon Valley of ransomware gangs now." Like, great.
Can you talk a little bit about? Can you talk at all about what the Department of Justice did to claw back the money and how those tactics evolved?
I don't know specifically what they did, I will say. I don't know the technical specifics, but there is a level to which something I would just add as a comment. With the internet and with cyberspace, we sort of have this tendency sometimes when we first hear about these problems to think, oh my God, these are just kind of heretofore unseen problems. Do we need to make a new department? Do we need to make a new task force? Do we need to make some sort of, fancy new hacker army of our own or hacker navy of our own to take these guys on? And then you kind of dig down, and one reason I wanted to make it sort of that more mundane criminal parallel of piracy is to say, no, these tactics and the way to counter them may actually be quite routine and quite well practiced and experienced as well. This may just at the end of the day be a financial crime, where we just have to track down the money, claw it back, make sure it can't be spent anywhere else. And yes, I'm not going to say like, drugs have gone away because we've been able to claw back all of their money, right? This is, just because it's a financial crime we have tactics for, it doesn't mean it just goes away. But there are tools and there is experience, is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's, and if mean, maybe I don't know if you can talk at all about the cryptocurrency space and how pressures on that might work.
Look, look, cryptocurrency is its own world, right? It's got its fans, it's got its proponents, it's got its policies. You know, Goldman Sachs is thinking about making serious investments there. I am not.
Fidelity.
Yeah, Fidelity might have been one I was thinking of. So if I really wanted to have, you know, the hordes of Twitter come after me, I'd say I kind of agree with people who say that, you know, we should be shutting down cryptocurrencies for various reasons. Like one of them is just the damage it does to the environment with the electricity farming aspect of it. And another is that it's being used, you know, mostly to foster, lately to foster this particular explosion in ransomware attacks, which is also hugely damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, though, again, I'm not trying to invite the hordes of Twitter down upon me. I'm not trying to say that, you know, there might be good sides to it that I'm just not that familiar with. The only time, I guess I'll just end it by saying I have not heard anything about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin or Dogecoin or whatever is out there that makes me think they're a good thing. So I only ever hear about them as a cybersecurity expert insofar as they're being used to support ransomware or, you know, electricity mining. But
yeah, I mean, there's a lot to explore there on and how they may provide a valuable alternative currency given the global currency fluctuations. But I think the question I have is like whether there certainly is some element of technological innovation that the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency community has to build in order to shut off what's going on. I mean, I think it, you know, neither you nor I are perhaps as well versed as the audience maybe would want, but because we're historians and strategists, we're just learning about this element of cryptocurrency. But the way that it was discovered under the Department of Justice case with DarkSide and how they clawed it back is they actually traced the Bitcoin wallets and they found the wallet that it was in and then they pulled it back, which is an interesting thing that I could not do, but I think is very worthwhile for folks to explore. And certainly within the cryptocurrency community, I can probably argue without any real knowledge right now that it has to evolve such that this kind of situation becomes harder and harder for it to do. Certainly, so if you take away the cryptocurrency path, then we have structures in place within international banking to sanction criminals who are trying to transfer money into a bank somewhere. There are much more robust controls on the basis of past financial crimes. So they're clearly exploiting this new and ungoverned space in the crypto domain in order to move money about. But this has been so enriching, and I think we all are looking forward to reading your articles about piracy. One last question I have from a historian standpoint: were there dictators in the past or dictatorial types, totalitarian types who had pirates that they used in their employ? Or was it that we can draw historical experiences from? Have you seen that kind of unique case? Because that would seem to mirror Putin's element of control, particularly a totalitarian in a large state that has some resources available to it. In his case, it's a massive military. Because what he's able to do is he's able to potentially employ these ransomware criminal gangs, but then he also has this much larger deterrence capability that prevents the US from doing certain things in an escalatory environment. So I wonder if there are historical examples of a strong state employing pirates in this way.
Yes, I would say the first would be Queen Elizabeth I. Employed the sea dogs like Walter Raleigh, and they were sort of, you know, ancillary to the wider British, you know, or British, you know, military and navy, kind of doing their own thing on the side in what was, you know, this ongoing war with Spain, this sort of Anglo-Spanish war that went on for decades. It was a bit of a Cold War. It was kind of always on and off. And that's where your, you know, golden age of piracy is situated, really, is in that conflict between Spain and England for the seas, for the Caribbean. And that's kind of where all the legend comes out of. But your Sir Walter Raleigh's and your various other figures whose names are not in front of me, and there's a lot of Thomases in there, but basically, yes. So she employed what I would say are privateers. I would argue that the Russian hacker army is really privateers, because the definition of pirate is somebody who attacks without regard to nation. And we've seen that if they're not attacking with DarkSide, for example, they're not attacking devices that have Cyrillic alphabet installed as the main alphabet, which to me is roughly privateer-ish. We don't want to attack certain, so it's not without regard to nation. But I would also say the Barbary pirates, one thing that's sort of obfuscated in the way that the US often discusses it, that conflict, is that they were privateers as well. So they were working with a higher authority. They were sheltered by local governments. And so I actually think the Barbary pirates, I need to explore, as I put my longer presentation on this subject together, I'm going to be exploring them quite deeply, because that sort of semi-state sanctioned, certainly state protected element where the Ottoman Empire was allowing these guys to operate, was supporting them to a certain extent, some of whom may have been, actually officials within that government, and who were also preying upon enemy nation navies, enemy nation merchants, or just, third-party merchants in general. That parallel may be so rich as to just be like, yeah, Putin is just the Ottoman Empire Barbary pirates all over again. You might be able to just come back and say that. I just don't want to say it too authoritatively now, because I want to dig into it a little more myself. But I think that parallel may go deeper than I realized when I first sort of struck upon it.
Yeah, well, it's just fascinating, and I'm so grateful to be able to talk to you today, and it's wonderful to have you on. I think we're probably running up on time. And thank you for everyone who joined. Keep your eyes out for Maggie's historical presentations and her strategic presentations, and also her fiction and nonfiction. But I think the clear message is, like, there are a modicum of investments that companies can make to make this problem much harder for the attacker. And a lot of the ransomware attacks that we've seen, companies just didn't have the capabilities that they needed, and they hadn't prepared for it. So I think the earlier slide where you talked about sort of the number of people that would get fired, the high number of costs associated with a ransomware attack, that should be very instructive for any company. Say, look, like, you're going to lose 33% of your C-suite or something like that if you fall victim to something like this. So it's not a tremendous investment. It's a solvable problem, and you have really smart people like Maggie MacAlpine who are here to help us think about it. So thank you again, Maggie, for joining.
Thank you.
And yeah, we look forward to having you on again.
Me too. Thank you, Alex.